Chapter 4 of Aquila. Miss Polson, the history teacher, was discussing the difficulties of trench warfare and had begun to explain the importance of air reconnaissance when her voice trailed off into silence. She had just seen that Jeff Reynolds had his hand up. "I was wondering," he asked, "if you knew how the pilots found their way around then, if they didn't have radar and things." For a moment, Miss Polson was too astonished to speak. She could hardly have been more surprised if the radiator had stepped away from the wall and casually announced it wanted to stand somewhere else. Jeff never spoke in class, unless you asked him a direct question, and sometimes not then. "I'm sorry?" she asked. "How they knew how to get to anywhere," Jeff repeated patiently. "The pilots, without instruments." Miss Polson quickly recovered and gave the class a brief lecture on the early techniques of air navigation. "They followed the natural features of the land, you see," she explained. "With a map and a compass, they could follow the roads, the rivers, and the railway lines. They could use the landmarks, like churches and castles, and of course, if they got lost, they could always land in a field and look at a signpost or something. Though, as a matter of fact, the air ace von Richthofen once said that with a map and a compass, it was actually more difficult to get lost in the air than it was on land." She was quite touched, as she later told her colleagues, at how grateful Jeff had been for the information and how his friend Tom had actually asked her to speak more slowly so that he had time to make proper notes. Mr. Urquhart was one of the little circle that had gathered in the staff room to hear her extraordinary story, and he decided he might mention it to Miss Taylor. He had a feeling she would be interested. On their way home after school, the boys bought a compass from Millet's and a large road atlas of Great Britain from Smith's. Sitting in Tom's bedroom, they carefully began working out their route. "The last bit's going to be the trickiest," said Jeff, "coming down and landing in your garden. That's when we're most likely to be seen. The only way is to do it fast. Faster the better. I think it'd better be me." He took another biscuit from the plate Mrs. Baxter had provided. "Which means you'd better go out with Mr. Urquhart and do the first leg." "You think I should go first?" Tom had not had a great deal of sleep the night before. His face was pale, and he had developed a nervous tic in the cheek under his right eye. "On my own?" "It's probably best." Jeff was still studying the map. "I mean, if there's any problem with navigating and things, at least you can come down and check a signpost." Jeff himself would not be able to check any signposts. As Miss Taylor had rightly assessed, Jeff could not read. He was one of those unfortunate people who, when presented with a word like lemon, sometimes see it as melon, sometimes as normal, and only occasionally as lemon. It can make learning to read a confusing process, and Jeff had long since abandoned any serious attempt at doing it. "Tomorrow we'll find a quiet place outside town where you can pick me up. One of those fields behind the station might be good." Jeff took another biscuit, and then realized it was the last, and that Tom had not yet had any. "I'm not very hungry," said Tom. "You go ahead." Jeff looked closely at his friend. "You're quite sure this is all right?" "Oh, definitely." Tom nodded vigorously. "Absolutely fine." His cheek twitched violently a couple of times. "I mean, if you don't want to do it, you can always change your mind." "Not a chance." The half of Tom's face that wasn't twitching gave a good impression of his smile. No, looking forward to it. It'll be an adventure." Before Jeff could reply, Mrs. Baxter came in to say it was time he went home. She wanted Tom to get to bed early that night. She thought he needed to catch up on his sleep. On Friday, they gathered together all the things Tom would need for the journey. In a backpack, they put the road atlas, the compass, the mobile phone, one of the first aid kits from Tom's bathroom, some chocolates, a piece of rope so Tom could tie himself to the seat so he did not fall out, and a second map he had bought in case the first one blew away in the wind. Both boys learned the route they would take until they knew it backwards. They needed to know it backwards, of course, as they were traveling both ways. And then, after school, they cycled out to check the exact spot in the field behind the station where Jeff would be waiting for Tom to pick him up. By the time he got home that evening, the twitch in Tom's cheek had become so violent that it was difficult to drink his hot chocolate without spilling it. Mrs. Baxter was quite concerned and asked if he was feeling ill. Tom assured her that he had never felt better, but by Saturday morning when Mr. Urquhart arrived, on top of the twitching, he had developed a slight stammer. "Frankly, I'm worried about him," Mrs. Baxter admitted. "I've told him he ought to stay in bed, but he won't hear of it. He's been so looking forward to going out with you." I'm okay, said Tom. Really, I'm fine. Perhaps he's getting the same thing as Jeff Reynolds, said Mr. Urquhart. He rang me this morning saying he can't come today. Apparently, he's got a stomach virus. Mrs. Baxter looked doubtfully at Tom. Maybe you should stay at home, she said. You haven't had any breakfast, and you look awful. I'm fine, Tom insisted. You can't keep me at home today. You just can't. Mr. Urquhart rather admired his determination. Don't worry, Mrs. Baxter, he smiled reassuringly. I'll bring him straight home if there's any problem. He turned to Tom. Come on, then, let's go. Tom picked up his bag and followed the teacher down the drive, his head twitching rhythmically as they went. Mrs. Baxter, of course, did not come out to the car. She stayed indoors and waved goodbye from the window. The site at the quarry looked very different from the day that Tom and Jeff had fallen into it. Most of the undergrowth had been cleared. Poles and tapes crisscrossed the ground in neat squares. To one side, a row of tents had been erected along with 2 caravans and some portaloos, and the entrance to the cave, where they had found the skeleton, was now covered in polythene sheeting, wrapped around scaffolding to protect it from the weather. Dr. Warner came over to meet them as they climbed out of the car. She was wearing a denim waistcoat which showed a tattoo on each shoulder, and her hair was a different color, but she greeted them warmly and insisted on showing them round herself. In one of the tents, the skeleton of the Roman soldier lay stretched out on a table with his armor beside him. We've established he was a centurion of the 20th Legion, she explained, and the coins we found, as well as the details of the armor, mean he probably died somewhere towards the end of the 3rd century. Mr. Urquhart asked if they had any idea how he had died. We think it was an accident. Dr. Warner gave the skull an affectionate rap with her knuckles. I don't know if you noticed the type of rock in the cave. Carboniferous limestone, said Tom. Mr. Urquhart gave him an odd look, but Dr. Warner only nodded approvingly. Precisely. The tunnel was the shaft of a lead mine, and as far as we can see, he just happened to be in there when the roof collapsed. You mean he suffocated? Dr. Warner nodded. The odd thing is, the mine was worked out at least 100 years before, so we're a little puzzled as to why our man was down there. Perhaps he was hiding something, Mr. Urquhart suggested, something he didn't want anyone else to find. If he was, we haven't found it yet. Dr. Warner led them over to another table. All we've dug up so far are these. She pointed to a large collection of amphorae that had, she explained, once contained wine from all corners of the empire. And there's this, of course, she added, moving to the end of the table and picking up a collection of leather straps joined by a series of buckles and clips. We're not sure what it is, but my theory is that it's a safety harness. You know, to stop a Roman pilot falling out of his jet when he's looping the loop. Mr. Urquhart was the first to realize she was joking and laughed politely. It has a neat inscription. Dr. Warner ran her fingers over the letters cut out into one of the leather cross straps. Licet voler si intergo Aquila volat. Aquila? Tom looked up. Well, what does that mean? An eagle, said Dr. Warner. It's an old Latin proverb. A man can fly where he will if he rides on the back of an eagle. Now, she put down the harness. How about some luncheon, then I'll show you the cave. Mr. Urquhart looked at his watch and explained that he didn't really have time for lunch. As he had told the boys, his main reason for coming out to the site was so that he could find some alternative locations for his next geography field trip. I'll be back about 2, he told Tom. You're sure you'll be all right here till then? Fine, said Tom, his face twitching violently. Nope, problem at all. When Mr. Urquhart had left, Tom asked Dr. Warner if she would mind if he went for a walk. What he would do if she had said yes, he had no idea, but she made no objection. Sure, go ahead, she gave him a smile, but be careful. People fall down holes in the ground around here. Aquila was still there. Carefully, Tom pulled aside the bales of straw that had covered it, climbed inside, and then sat for a moment watching as the lights blinked into life. He opened his backpack, took out the rope, and looped it under his seat before tying the ends firmly round his waist. Then he took out the compass, the road map, the telephone, a small piece of paper, and some sellotape. The paper was a drawing of the 4 blue lights, shaped like a flower. On each of the quarters, Tom had written a reminder of what pressing that particular button would do. Forward, back, up, and down. And now he carefully taped the picture to the dashboard alongside the real thing. He kept the compass in his lap and put the map and the telephone on the seat beside him. Carefully reaching out, he put the tip of his finger on the button that his diagram said meant forward. Gently he pushed, and Aquila floated forward light as a thistledown, out of the barn into the sunshine. The hills and grassland of the Peak District were spread out before him, but Tom was not in the mood to admire scenery. The next thing was to go up. He moved his finger to the button at the top, pushed, and Aquila rose silently through the air. There was no real sensation of movement. If Tom had had his eyes closed, he would barely have been aware that he was moving at all. But when he looked over the side, he saw a tractor that seemed no bigger than a spot of paint traveling across a field below him. "Go high," Jeff had said. "If the cars look like little dots, then that's what you'll look like to them." It seemed high enough. Tom took up the compass, found east, and pulled on the handle with his right hand to swing Aquila around. It was as he reached out to push the forward button again that he realized the strangest thing had happened. He was not frightened anymore. It was an almost perfect flight. Tom had been traveling for only a few minutes before he realized he could see his first landmark, the 6-lane ribbon of the motorway, directly ahead. When he was above it, he stopped, swung Aquila round to the left, and followed the road north until he saw the unmistakable pattern of a junction. He stopped again, turned east, and tracked what, according to his map, was the A617 to Southwell. A large town passed below him at a point where the map said he ought to be flying over Mansfield. Shortly after that, Sherwood Forest went by just where it was supposed to be, and then he saw the railway, cutting across the countryside ahead as clearly as a line on a piece of paper. A goods train was heading north, and Tom turned to follow it the last dozen miles to home. His only mistake was deciding to double-check his position by going down to look at a road sign. Knowing that all road turnings have signposts, he took Aquila down to a junction to look at one, and found that everything was just as it should be. According to the sign, Staveley was 7 miles ahead, and he was about to take Aquila back up when he heard the sound of an approaching car. Anxious not to be seen, Tom hurriedly pushed the up button, but unfortunately hit the back button at the same time, with the result that Aquila shot up backwards and upwards at an angle of 45 degrees, taking a set of telephone cables and 3 telegraph poles as it went. At about 150 meters, the wires and the trailing poles slid off the back of Aquila and plummeted casually back to earth like a set of darts. Tom, peering over the side, was relieved to see them land among some trees instead of in the road. 2 minutes later, he was bringing Aquila down in the field behind Staveley Station and coasting over the grass to where an ecstatic Jeff was waiting. "Fantastic! You did it!" Jeff punched him happily on the shoulder. "No problems or anything?" "Not really," said Tom. "Nothing worth mentioning." Jeff took the controls for the journey back. With Tom map reading, they flew south down the railway line to Penton Castle and turned right. They followed the road back through Sherwood Forest and Mansfield to the motorway, turned south again, and finally due west to bring themselves back to the park. When Jeff dropped Tom off by the barn, they found the whole journey had taken a little under 12 minutes. 10 minutes after that, Tom was back with Dr. Warner, and when Mr. Urquhart returned, he found the two of them in the canteen tent discussing how the Romans might have gone about extracting lead ore from limestone. "Smart boy, that," the archaeologist commented as she walked with Mr. Urquhart to his car. "Must be fun having someone like that in your class." "Yes, it's very stimulating." Mr. Urquhart hesitated. "Can I ask, you didn't have any trouble getting him to talk?" "Trouble?" Dr. Warner laughed. "I don't think he stopped since he got back from his walk. Except to eat, of course." She looked across to the canteen tent where Tom was finishing what had to be his 4th pizza. "You forget how much they can tuck away at that age, don't you?" "What did he talk about?" "All sorts of things, really. He was asking lots of questions about Roman technology to start with. You know, whether they knew about electricity, that sort of thing. Then we got on to flying for some reason, but mostly, of course, we've been discussing rocks." She shook her head in admiration. "Not many boys his age know that much geology. Surprised me." "Yes," said Mr. Urquhart thoughtfully. "It can surprise a lot of people. I'm very grateful to you." "Grateful? Well, coming out here's obviously done him a lot of good." Mr. Urquhart looked at Tom as he walked over to the car. There was a smile on his face, no trace of a twitch, and even his stammer seemed to have disappeared. "Are you sure all you did was talk to him?" Talk and eat, said Dr. Warner. I promise you that's all he's done since he got here. Mr. Urquhart thanked her again, climbed into his car, and wondered what on earth he was going to tell Miss Taylor. When Tom got home, Mrs. Baxter told him that Jeff was out in the garage and wanted to see him. He's been out there for hours waiting for you to come back, she said. Apparently, he's got something to show you. In the garage, Tom found Jeff sitting in Aquila. He had washed off all the bits of mud that had stuck to the hull in the cave and had carefully swept out the bits of loose straw that had got into the cockpit while it was in the barn. He had also stuck a couple of Go Fast stickers down each side and another one on the back that said, My other car's a Ferrari. He climbed out when Tom appeared, and for some minutes the two boys simply stood there together and stared at it. You got back all right then? Asked Tom eventually. No one saw you? I don't think so. Jeff reached out and stroked a hand along the upward curve of Aquila's bow, then ran it along to the bottom of one of the gold letters. I wonder why it's called Aquila. It means an eagle, said Tom. An eagle? Tom nodded. A man can fly anywhere if he rides on the back of an eagle. Too right, said Jeff softly. Too right.